Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this event today on working with LGBTQ youth and families throughout the lifespan. My name is Mickey Washburn. My pronouns are she and her, and I am an assistant professor at the UT Arlington School of Social Work. And today we have an amazing panel of presenters to talk to you today about different aspects of working affirmatively with LGBTQ youth and families. Now, our presenters are really unique in the fact that they have not only lived experience, but also clinical experience and professional experience working with LGBTQ youth and families. Some of us are parents of LGBTQ youth. A lot of us identify as part of the community. And so we hope that this is going to be a great starting point for some conversations around how to work more effectively with these families to make sure that we're ensuring health and safety and acceptance of all of the children, youth, and families out there in our community. And I just have a few housekeeping things to go over. We will have a moderated Q&A session at the end. And so if you have any questions, don't use the raise hand option or anything like that. Please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A dialog box that's at the bottom of your screen, and I will be going through and selecting questions at the end for our panelists to address. Also, we will be putting in the chat box a link to the evaluation. I'm not going to put that link up until the end of the presentation so that you can go ahead and fill out the evaluation, and if you need CEUs, that's going to be the way in which you get the CEUs for the class. We're also going to be having the presenters will be putting some resources for you and some links into the chat box. So that's something that you want to go ahead and be aware of. And also at the end, I will be putting their email addresses. So if you have some specific questions for a specific presenter, then you can go ahead and contact them after the presentation. We're going to be going until about 1 o'clock today. And so I'm looking forward to spending this time with y'all. So I am going to go ahead and start us off by introducing our first presenter. It's Dr. Brittany Ash, who is an assistant professor also at the UT Arlington School of Social Work. And Brittany uses research on LGBTQ plus populations as an exemplar for understanding the dynamics and processes of oppression in communities and in social work practice and education. Her work relies heavily on an intersectional lens to deepen the discipline's understanding of risk and resilience among people who live at the crossroads of marginalized identities. And so I'd like everybody to welcome Dr. Brittany Ash.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. And really what I'm gonna go over today is really just to kind of lay some groundwork for us as we enter into this conversation. And what that looks like is language. And so what do we mean when we talk about working with the LGBTQ plus community or working with LGBTQ plus youth? And this is a really important conversation to have because language is constantly shifting within the LGBTQ plus community. And there's so many different identities represented when we say LGBTQ plus. And you may hear people say the LGBTQ community, the LGBTQ plus community, the LGBTQAI plus community. So not only is language constantly shifting, but different people and different organizations may use different acronyms to describe the community. So really, let's just jump in. So to begin, when we're talking about the LGBTQ plus community, we're really talking about two separate identities being represented in that acronym. And really there's one umbrella term in that, which is the Q, which stands for queer. But really first, sexual orientation or a person's physical / romantic or emotional attraction to another person is represented by the LGBTQ in that umbrella term that we're talking about. And really the second thing we're talking about is gender identity, which is a person's internal and deeply held sense of their gender. And that's represented by the T and the Q when we're talking about LGBTQ+. So back to the Q, which I said was kind of this umbrella term. Really, it is often used as an umbrella term to really talk about the community at large or identity at large. And so it can really represent both sexual orientation and gender identity. And I'm not going to be sharing any PowerPoints or anything, but everything I'm going to talk about in this, like when we're talking about language, I'm going to give several resources at the end of my conversation so that you can go back and reference. But I also said this earlier to the panelists, but there is some lawn work happening outside of my window. So if you hear that, or if you're having trouble hearing me, somebody let me know, and I apologize for that. But let's go back to sexual orientation and the LGBTQA+ acronym that we're talking about. And really, that really represents people who don't identify as heterosexual. And some examples of identities that fall under that may be lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, and pansexuality is sexual, romantic, emotional attraction towards folks really regardless of their sex or gender identity. And then there's demisexual, and that describes people who only feel sexually attracted to folks if there's an emotional bond between those people. And then you see the A, and sometimes that can mean ally, or it can stand for people who identify or as asexual. And that includes people who don't experience sexual attraction to others of any gender, or you might hear the term aces to describe folks that identify as asexual. And it's important to talk about many of these identities that we're talking about are often ignored when we're talking about the LGBTQ+ community. But anyways, these are just a few terms that represent sexual orientation. And I was doing some work the other day, and there are over 30 different ways to describe sexual orientation. So what we're quickly talking about today, I think I have, like 10, 15 minutes to talk about. There's so much more when we think about the LGBTQ+ community and what identities are represented under that umbrella. So again, I'm going to give some resources at the end. So when we're talking about the T in the LGBTQ+ acronym, we're talking about gender identity. And the T really represents folks who are not cisgender. And cisgender means someone whose head, heart, and body aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. And people along the trans spectrum, may identify as transgender, a transgender woman, a trans man, as a woman, as a man, as non-binary, as agender, as genderless, as bigender, or something else. And when we're talking about gender identity, it's important to talk about the use of pronouns. And I forgot to say that I use she, her pronouns. And many folks that fall within a binary gender identity, like man or woman or boy or girl, may use she, her, or he, him pronouns. And folks that identify as non-binary or outside of a binary gender identity may use they, them pronouns. It's important. I want to make a note just about also when we're thinking about like working with trans youth or families, that a lot of folks have a misconception that there's some sort of surgery that accompanies folks that identify as trans or are in some sort of gender affirmation process. And just to say that many folks that identify as trans do not seek surgery as part of their journey to affirm their identity. And I think that's especially important for folks that want to serve trans and gender diverse and gender expansive youth in an inclusive way as they go about their gender journey. So I just wanted to quickly say that. Lastly, I wanted to talk about another community that's often ignored in the LGBTQAI+ community, and that's the intersex community. And intersex is an umbrella term that describes bodies that fall outside of the strict biological male female binary. And there's lots of ways that someone can be intersex. And just like just like how doctors assign everyone a sex at birth, Doctors assign intersex folks a gender at birth as well, and that doesn't mean that that's the gender identity that they will also always identify with. Lastly, I mentioned that language shifts, and it's especially important for us as social workers to make sure that we're using inclusive language. So like I said, I did want to provide some resources to check out to make sure that we aren't using harmful or outdated language. And two that I often use a lot are the GLAAD media guides. And there's one for LGBTQ language, and there's one for transgender inclusive language. So I'm going to put those in the chat. I'm also going to drop a link that is a video that goes more in depth about language included in the LGBTQ plus umbrella. And this might be good for y'all if you're like, what the heck is she talking about? She talked way too fast and I had no idea what she was saying. Or if you think or the organization you work at could use a refresher on inclusive language. So that's going to be a YouTube video. And lastly, I'm going to share the NASW's website on inclusive practice with LGBTQ plus folks. And there's a lot of really good information there. And there's also some information on additional professional development if that's something that you're looking for or your organization is looking for. But what this NASW site does is also directly connects our role as social workers to practice ethically and inclusively with the queer and trans community. And a lot of folks might, not think about what our role as social workers to practice justly means as we interact with the LGBTQ plus community and working with LGBTQ plus youth and families. So just in case you were wondering what your role was or what our approach as social workers to be to work inclusively with marginalized communities, that kind of can give you some more information there. So lastly, as Mickey mentioned, some of us are part of the queer community, and I am. And as a social worker and as a person new to Texas, I just wanted to call in a few outdated / harmful terms that I've faced since coming to Texas, so that we can leave here today knowing at least some words to avoid. And one of those is the term gay lifestyle or trans lifestyle. There is no single LGBTQ plus lifestyle. We are a diverse set of people, and those phrases like gay lifestyle typically are used to suggest that sexual orientation or gender identity is a choice, and therefore can be cured, if you will. And you might also hear the word like homosexual lifestyle or the word homosexual, and that is an outdated term also. And typically it's seen as a harmful term because it has a clinical history and has been used by anti-LGBTQ people and extremists to suggest that that LGBTQ folks are somehow like sick or something is wrong with them. So and how I talk about, if you're going to use the word homosexual, maybe to reference like a historical document, I always say to put it in quotes. And so, yeah, that's just a word to avoid. And also something I come across a lot in writing is putting ED or S on the end of words. So like transgendered or gays, we should never tack an ED onto the end of words. It also brings in language like transgender into alignment when we say like lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer. So for example, you wouldn't say the two examples that I hear often are like, you wouldn't say Elton John is gay or Ellen DeGeneres is lesbian. Therefore, you wouldn't say that Elliot Page is transgendered. So the same can be said for adding in an S. But that's really, I just wanted to kind of give us the groundwork for language that we're going to hear today. And like I said, I'm going to drop several links. And also I think it's important for me and for other folks just to recognize that I am not an expert, even though I am a part of the LGBTQ plus community. This is an area that we are always learning and always evolving in. So if you have questions, if anything in my bio that Mickey read sounded interesting and you want to know more, always email me.
All right, thank you so much for a great presentation, Brittany. And as she mentioned, please put your questions into the Q&A box so that we can address those at the end, because I'm sure a lot of people may have questions about the resources that are going to be provided or about some of the things that we're seeing in our narratives. And so next up, we have...
Can I ask a question really quick?
Yes.
Where do I put the resources, in our Zoom chat box, or is there somewhere else that I should?
There's a chat box that you can select all of the participants rather than just the panelists,
okay.
And you can put it right in there.
Sorry, I should have
asked it
earlier.
Yes. Yes, no, that's a great question. Thanks. So Devin is going to be our next presenter. So Devin is a social worker at the Dallas Independent School District's Mental Health Services Program, where they served as a licensed mental health clinician in a community-based clinic in South Dallas. They earned their MSW degree from the University of Texas at Arlington, and they were one of my students and was amazing, where they conducted research on the experiences of transgender and gender-expansive youth as a part of their master's thesis. Devin serves on 2 statewide committees focused on improving the care for LGBTQ plus youth within the child welfare system, and they are involved in the Dallas ISD initiatives geared towards improving LGBTQ plus equity and inclusion. So I am going to turn it over to Devin.
Thank you so much, Mickey, and thank you for having me on the panel today. My name is Devin. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about the T part of the acronym that Dr. Ash was talking about. So supporting trans and gender expansive clients across the lifespan. So I'm going to go ahead and I've put together just a brief PowerPoint for our visual learners out there. And share this. Let's see here. Okay, we're just going to view it from this place because I don't know how to put it on slideshow. I'm going to draw a little bit on my personal experience as a trans and non-binary person, as well as my professional experience as an LMSW in clinical practice and a researcher with this population. So to start out, I'd like to give us a little bit of sociocultural context for understanding this population, keeping in mind that not every trans and gender expansive client that you work with is going to experience all of these things. So it's important to never make assumptions about a person based on their identity, but I do think it is important to understand some common vulnerabilities and experiences. And just a note about vocabulary. So when I say gender expansive, I am referring to kind of an umbrella term that captures people who don't identify within the binary gender system. So they don't identify as male or female. And so this can include non-binary, gender fluid, agender, bigender. There are a number of different terms. So just a little insight into that. So if we look at it from a systems perspective, sort of starting from the top down at the macro level, we see experiences of systemic discrimination and exclusion. And so what this can look like is a lack of access to services, exclusion and erasure, hostility and harm, and then this experience of trans people having to educate and advocate for themselves within these systems of power. And so these systems can include medical and mental health care systems, educational, criminal, and legal, access in public spaces, as well as employment and housing. And so just because of time constraints, I'm really just going to give an example of what that will look like with one system. But for example, in the medical system, if you're a trans person seeking out medical care, you may have to sort of weigh the urgency of your medical need with the expectation of harm. So not knowing if the healthcare provider that you're seeing is going to have negative beliefs about trans people. Are they going to even provide me care, or are they going to provide substandard care? Is this a person that I'm going to have to educate and advocate for myself when I'm in this vulnerable position of seeking care? And, is this a person where I'm not sure if they're safe, so I have to hide parts of my medical history so that I'm not outed as trans to them? Additionally, there can be barriers with health insurance coverage. I know there are a lot of health insurance policies that have trans exclusionary clauses within their policies, where you're not able to access gender affirming care, such as hormone replacement therapy or gender affirming surgical interventions solely on the basis of your transgender identity. Now, that's not legal, but it does happen. I know from personal experience, it does happen in the state of Texas. And so when you're looking at the client sitting in front of you and you're getting that broader context that they're operating in, you're gathering that social history, and you're understanding a little bit more about their overall well-being, I think it's important to recognize that some of these systems may operate in their lives in a way that is oppressive and in a way that there are barriers. And so thinking about how you can advocate for them, building up a good referral network of providers that you know are affirming that you can provide to those clients. This community also faces issues of interpersonal violence and victimization. In our trans youth, we see increased rates of bullying. We see higher adverse childhood experiences. For those of you who are familiar with the ACEs study, we see increases in familial and peer rejection. So a lot of times facing hostility in some of the main environments that kids are in. So in their family environments, at home, and in their school environments. And then across the lifespan, we see disparities in terms of assault, abuse, intimate partner violence, and then those microaggressions, which are sort of those daily kind of subtle acts of exclusion that build up and accumulate over time and cause a great deal of harm. We also see issues of intrapersonal violence. So those experiences of internalized transphobia, of self-harm and suicidality, which are all very much a result of these systems that oppress. So with that kind of brief overview of the sociocultural context, I'd like to move into talking about how the mental health care system and social work field has historically interacted with the community. I think it's important to recognize that we as a trans community have historical memory of what our experiences have been with the mental health care field. So as recently as 1980, the DSM included gender identity disorder as a mental health disorder. So actually really pathologizing the experience of being trans. And so that is harmful and has certainly created barriers and distrust and real harm against the community. They have updated it in the DSM-5 to gender dysphoria, and a lot of times insurance providers will require that diagnosis in order to receive affirming care, which leads us into gatekeeping. So that is another significant issue with this community. I will have a resource to drop in the links at the end on WPATH, but they are the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare, and they publish professional guidelines on treatment with this population. So really encourage you to check it out, especially if you're in clinical practice. But they simply suggest individual counseling. They don't mandate it. And a lot of providers engage in a gatekeeping sort of process where they'll place this emotional, mental, and financial burden on trans clients to prove that they need this life-saving care that they're requesting. And so having them engage in services for a longer period of time, simply as a way of gatekeeping. And then finally, this is, I think, one of the biggest issues with this community and mental health care is a lack of cultural competence. This occurs for clients across the lifespan, and to sort of relate it back to the medical healthcare system I was talking about. Again, for a trans or gender diverse client seeking out mental health care, there's the concern, is this therapist or social worker going to have negative beliefs about trans people? Are they going to engage in microaggressions against me? Are they going to pathologize my identity? Are they going to understand the context in which I operate. And so that can be a really significant barrier to receiving care. The Trevor Project put out their 2020 LGBTQ youth mental health survey, and they found that for trans and gender expansive youth, the biggest barrier to receiving mental health care is the ability to afford care. And so for those of us who are in practices where we're setting fees or where we're billing, I think I would encourage you as a social justice value and practice to consider the possibility of sliding scales for your trans clients, considering the disparities in all of these areas in that sociocultural context. The Trevor Project survey also found that a lot of these trans and gender expansive youth were not able to receive wanted mental health care due to concerns related to LGBTQ competence. And so again, sort of, having that burden as the trans person to educate and advocate in the setting where they're vulnerable. And that really shouldn't be their responsibility. That should be on us as professionals. And so if we think of our social work ethics, our ethical standards of competence and culture awareness, and view on us this ethical responsibility to learn about these communities and to provide affirming care and to cause no harm. And so I'd like to talk now, I'm going to kind of wrap it up here with how to provide affirming care and create safer spaces. So this is kind of an overview and sort of a place to start. And I would encourage you to check out some of the resources I'll drop in the chat. Because this is not at all a training on exactly how to do this, but this is sort of an overview. So the first thing I would suggest is to examine your own personal identity, your positionality, your experiences of privilege and power, and your beliefs and biases. So going on sort of your own self-reflective deep dive and considering your experiences with your gender identity and how you're positioned within society. I would also encourage you to focus on client resilience and strengths. I come from a very much strengths-based perspective, and I think that a lot of the literature and a lot of experiences within society focus on all of the harm and the violence and the victimization that happens. And while that is important context to hold, I think it's also important to really support clients in celebrating their identity and finding those strengths and building on them and creating networks to help them bolster the resilience. And those can actually mitigate some of those vulnerability factors. We also need to be advocating for culturally responsive organizational practices. I will drop this link in the chat, but there's a free webinar resource on the National Child Traumatic Stress Network website where you can learn more about how, as an organization, you can implement more culturally responsive practices. Again, we also really need to understand these clients' sociocultural context. I failed to touch on this at the beginning, but if we look at it from an intersectional lens, understanding that different experiences of marginalization in different parts of people's identity can compound those vulnerabilities. So Black trans women are disproportionately affected by violence, and trans people of color as a whole. And so understanding that different groups face overlapping or interlocking oppressions and understanding that context. I would also encourage you to consult. And this is a great way that you can put your social justice value into practice by supporting trans and gender expansive clinicians who provide paid consultation services. I think considering the history of trans people with the mental health care field, it's really important to sort of rectify some of that historical harm by uplifting these marginalized voices and allowing people of lived experience to speak on their experiences in a way that is affirming. And so I would very much encourage you to engage in paid consultation with people of lived experience, and I'll have some links to share in the chat for that. And then finally, this is a big one. We need to be advocating outside of our organizations and engaging in that social justice principle across the US, there is currently a widespread push of trans antagonistic legislation, and we need allies in our corner. I think it's important to recognize that hearing one's identity and dignity and humanity debated in the public sphere by people of power who have the ability to take your rights away and to really do significant harm is very harmful to trans people. And so I think we need to have that awareness when we're working with trans clients. And we also need to be willing to step up and take on some of that burden for those of us who are in that ally space. And so I would encourage you to connect with your local organizations, engaging in legislative advocacy. And so I've included some resources here, and I'm going to drop all of these in the chat, but I've got a few academic articles that you can apply to your clinical practice. I mentioned WPATH earlier. I'd also like to highlight the Gender Affirming Letter Access Project for those who are in clinical practice and seeking to provide letters of referral. This kind of seeks to mitigate that gatekeeping aspect. And then finally, here are some trans and gender expansive clinicians that you can reach out to who do offer paid consultation and training. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here and pass the mic.
All right, well, thank you so much, Devin. You did a great job. So something that I do want to kind of piggyback on here is that there's a number of providers out there, especially here in Texas, that kind of present themselves as experts in this area after attending 1 or 2 trainings. And so when you are providing referrals to services, you want to be really careful about who you're referring people to. And so those resources that Devin put at the bottom of the page are really important. Also, I have seen an increasingly large number of people that present themselves as doing gender affirming care, but really what they're engaging in is SOGI change efforts. And so I put in the chat box that SOGI is sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Another term you might have heard for these things is conversion therapy, trying to make people that identify as gay or lesbian not gay or lesbian, trying to make people that identify as transgender, non-binary, or gender diverse to not identify in those ways. And so it's really important for those of you that are service providers out there that do a lot of referrals and service linkage to vet our resources really well. And Devin just put another good, reference into the chat box. But that's something I just wanted to go ahead and have everybody be aware of, that just because somebody says they have expertise in this area, that does not mean that they're going to be the type of provider that you're going to want to be referring people to. So now we are going to move to our colleague in Austin, Texas, Adam Mccormick. He is an associate professor of social work at St. Edward's University in Austin. He teaches courses in child welfare and social work with families and has a number of research interests. So Dr. McCormick actually has a couple of really great books that are good resources for everybody. And I hope that he'll put the full reference information for those into the chat after he's finished speaking. One of the books that he has authored is called LGBTQ Youth in the Foster Care System, Empowering Approaches to an Inclusive System of Care. And then he has a new book coming out that's called Supporting LGBTQ Youth in Foster Care, a Guide for Foster Caregivers, which is something that's been needed in our field for a very long time. And so I am going to turn it over to Adam.
Thanks so much, Mickey. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be with you. I'm Adam McCormick, he, him pronouns. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the systems that we see LGBTQI plus youth in particular, some of their experiences as they navigate some of those systems. And I think it's important to look more broadly at society. And there are so many things going on in our society. In fact, if you look at the course of the last 10 years, when you just look at overall acceptance and affirmation, you look at media representation, you look at even some policy issues, there's a lot to be celebrated when it comes to acceptance and affirmation. But at the same time, I always tell my social work students this, that when you talk about especially issues of things like racism or homophobia, transphobia, that essentially you want to look at those systems that members of different groups have disproportionately navigated to essentially get a sense of how real, right, or how profound that change is. And specifically for LGBTQI plus youth, despite all of the changes that we see in terms of acceptance and affirmation in the media and entertainment and in some of these other areas, even in schools in some ways. Even that data tends to lack a little bit. When we look at our systems, specifically systems like the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, the foster care system, homeless youth systems, we're not seeing much change in those systems, especially when we look at rates of disproportionality. So for instance, I've been doing research with LGBTQI plus youth in the Texas foster care system since I was a graduate student at UTA back in 2008, 2009. And we still see today rates of disproportionality of LGBTQI plus youth that are 3 times the representation in the general population, that essentially about 30% of teens in the nation's foster care system have LGBTQI plus identities. And that's a huge rate of disproportionality. Now, here in a state like Texas, when you talk to lawmakers and even sometimes when you talk to child welfare executives, their argument is going to be, well, that data comes from other places. That data comes from Connecticut, and it comes from California, and it comes from the West Coast. Well, that's true. I mean, we don't have those exact numbers here in Texas, but the reality is that when we look at many of the factors, especially family rejection, vulnerability to maltreatment that we've historically seen with LGBTQI plus youth, there's nothing going on here in Texas that we're doing any better in any of those domains or any of those areas than some of those more progressive places. So while we don't have that exact data here, I think the assumption for a lot of researchers, a lot of advocates, a lot of professionals out there who work in this field is that we likely have similar rates of disproportionality in the foster care system, juvenile justice system. About 20%, 1 in all 5 teens in the juvenile justice system are LGBTQI youth, disproportionately youth of color. Of course, many of us are familiar with the data on homeless youth in the United States as well as here in Texas. Anywhere from 41 to 44% of all homeless teens and young adults identify as LGBTQI plus. In just about every other system that we look at as well. But I'm going to focus a little bit on some of those systems, specifically youth in the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system. And then I'll close by talking a little bit about trafficking vulnerabilities of LGBTQI plus youth. But I think it's important at this point to reference a couple things that Devin said that I think are so vital and so important. And certainly, having done this research for the last 12, 13 years, Devin's point there about LGBTQI plus youth, despite all of the risks, still being a population with far more resilience and far more resourcefulness. And in that lens, especially given all of the research that we have now and all that we know now, provides us with a great opportunity to engage in really affirming and empowering practice. So I want to continue to kind of revisit that as we talk about some of these vulnerabilities, because I couldn't possibly agree more. But as Devin also mentioned there, as LGBTQI plus youth and adults, I'm talking specifically about youth here, but it's the same thing with adults. As they navigate many of these systems, they experience a lot of disparities, a lot of maltreatment, a lot of discrimination and oppression along the way. And so when we look at LGBTQI plus youth in foster care, we know there's huge issues with disproportionality. About 44% of teenagers with LGBTQ plus identities who are in the foster care system right now, or have been in the foster care system at some point, suggests that the reason that they came into care had something to do with their SOGI, something to do with their identity, right? There was either tension or hostility in their homes. They ran away from an environment that was hostile or tense, or potentially even threatening in some ways. They were kicked out of their homes. There were other factors in terms of criminal justice involvement or things that had to do with their identity that essentially put them on the radar of child welfare officials. When we look at every single area that we measure childhood maltreatment, be it physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglectful, parental neglect, parental betrayal, right? All of those, every single area of child maltreatment, or almost every single area of child maltreatment that we measure, we still see LGBTQI plus youth being survivors of every single form at disproportionately high rate. So that's one of the reasons that we see a lot of overrepresentation in systems like the child welfare system, foster care system, or the juvenile justice system, and certainly homeless youth systems as well. And it becomes very important to recognize and to remember that, because that trauma-informed lens, specifically in looking at the experiences of LGBTQI plus youth. One of the things that we teach about trauma-informed care, about trauma in general, and most of you I know probably already know this, but we really look at trauma in two forms. There's acute trauma, right? And acute trauma is essentially those trauma experiences where somebody has an experience that kind of maxes out a threshold. We're wired for stress in a way that once it meets a certain threshold, it becomes a traumatic experience or a lower order brain experience. And we think about things like domestic violence or dating violence or physical abuse or sexual abuse or a car accident or combat trauma. Those are all examples of acute traumatic stress. And then we have what we call toxic stress, and that's, we're wired for stress that meets a certain threshold in much the same way we're wired for stress that is temporary, that's not ongoing. And for a lot of kids who are experiencing toxic stress, things like childhood poverty or homelessness or living in the shadows of immigration in constant fear of parental deportation. And then, of course, for many LGBTQI plus youth, that toxic stress can be living in home environments that are unsafe, or navigating unsafe environments in the foster care system or homeless, whatever it might be. That essentially what we know is LGBTQI plus youth, we call that complex trauma, right? Navigate experiences of a complex trauma at increasingly high rates, at disproportionately high rates. So that trauma-informed lens, given all of those dynamics, becomes so critical, so vital, so important. The other factor that we look at that helps us to better understand overrepresentation in these systems is family rejection. And we know, despite all of the gains that we've made in this area, that still about 45% of LGBTQI plus youth report being in families that are rejecting in some way. Well, family acceptance is the single biggest predictor that we have in the research. It's a very seminal study that's over 10 years old now, but still has widespread implications for everything that we do in social work practice with LGBTQI plus youth, especially youth in these systems, that essentially those young people with accepting experiences, accepting families, are 8 times less likely to be suicidal, 6 times less likely to meet clinical criteria for depression, 3.5 times less likely to engage in risky sex and risky substance abuse. And so we don't, in these systems, be it the juvenile justice system, the foster care system, the homeless youth system, we're not doing a lot of family acceptance work, right? We're not working with families to help address some of those dynamics. Also for many kids who come into the foster care system with LGBTQI plus identities, we could keep them out of a system that we know does more harm than good for them. We can keep them out of the system by kind of expanding their kinship networks or options. That essentially, prior to placing a kid in the foster care system, we try to do our best, or we should try to do our best, to keep them with what we call kinship networks, right? Aunts, uncles, grandparents, whoever it might be that would be willing to care for them so that they don't have to go into the system. Well, for many LGBTQI plus youth, the reality is that their extended family options are limited, given the reality that many of them share a lot of the same ideological or religious convictions that are counter to acceptance and affirmation. And for many of them, especially those who experience homelessness and some of these other risk factors, for many of them, they create what we call fictive kinship networks, that they essentially have their own families because they're resourceful, they're resilient, right? In an effort to survive, which every behavior, again, using that trauma-informed lens, if you just look at that one aspect of survival, it helps you to look at all of the behaviors, even those that we've kind of researched in ways that look very deficit-based, risky sex, risky substance abuse, running away, some of those dynamics. What you find out very quickly is that those are rooted in survival, very resilient and resourceful behavior, right? So if we could expand our understanding of kinship, if we could say, hey, it may not be an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent for this kid, but it might be their best friend's parents or a teacher at school who they've developed a close bond or relationship with as a potential kinship provider. We can keep them from going into these systems that we know cause more harm than good. Because as we look at those experiences, once they come into care, LGBTQI plus youth experience a lot more placement instability. They're going to have about twice as many placement breakdowns as non-LGBTQ plus youth. There's increased vulnerability, increased maltreatment, and they're much more likely to either age out of the system or run away from the system, as opposed to be reunited with family or even going into foster homes in particular. So over 70% of LGBTQI teens who are in the foster care system today are in what we call group home or congregate care placements. These are more institutional placements. These are typically based upon emotional and behavioral need. But for many LGBTQI youth, they're in these programs not because they have the emotional or behavioral needs, but they're in these placements because our system, our social workers, our caseworkers can't find appropriate family placements for them. And there's a whole bunch of dynamics there. Here in Texas, we have an incredibly discriminatory policy. It's called the Religious Refusal Bill that was passed a couple of years ago that essentially provides foster care, child welfare agencies the right to refuse foster and adoptive parents' licenses if doing so doesn't align with their strongly held religious beliefs. It also provides foster caregivers and group home staff and other members a lot of flexibility to not provide affirming and accepting care to LGBTQI plus youth if doing so doesn't align with their strongly held religious beliefs. So there's a lot of systemic and structural dynamics, so many that we could never take the time to go into all of them. And I know I'm running out of time here. And so what we see is a lot of young people who age out of care or run away from care. Oftentimes when they're running away from care, they're having experiences of homelessness. I did a study a couple years back, and one of the questions that I asked youth in this sample, this was former foster youth who had experiences of homelessness, was to tell me a little bit about that decision to run away from care. Over half of the sample had run away from their foster homes. And it was very evident that the physical threats of the streets, right, or being homeless, or not having stable housing, or knowing that they're going to have to couch surf, or even in some instances knowing that they might have to engage in things like sex for residence or food or whatever it might be, in nowhere near compared to the emotional threats that they were experiencing kind of navigating the Texas foster care system. For them. So I think that's a really important context. So it's no wonder that when we look at rates of homelessness and we look at rates of trafficking, next to foster youth, LGBTQI youth are the population most vulnerable to child and young adult trafficking. And as you look at the grooming tactics and the strategies that perpetrators of trafficking use, in many instances, when you look at the strategic use of shame, use of silence, secrecy, offering comfort and safety, all of those dynamics, the reality is that for many LGBTQI plus youth, their families and in some instances, the systems that they navigate, especially the foster care system or the juvenile justice system, have a lot of that grooming already for them, making them so much more vulnerable to some of these tactics. Yeah, that's just a little glimpse. I'll post some resources here in the chat as well and link some of this research. But there's a great, especially those of you who are students, incredible opportunities for us to really change these systems to be so much more inclusive, affirming, and accepting of LGBTQI plus youth.
So much, Adam. And I think you brought up a really important point that we want to underscore here is that policy dictates the way that we do our practice. And so one of the really important things that is going on here in Texas right now is we have our legislature, which is in session. And for those of you who have worked with the legislature over the past years, you know that there are some a number of practices that they engage in that are not really on the up and up to kind of push bills through that can be problematic for LGBTQ youth and other oppressed groups here in Texas. And so in the chat window, I put some links to Equality Texas and to Land Bill Legal. They are actually doing a real-time tracking of a number of these bills that are currently either proposed or sitting in committee or have been moved to the floor that are impacting, that could potentially impact LGBTQ youth and families and other oppressed groups here in the state of Texas. And so if you're interested in making your voice heard and going ahead and offering testimony on whether you support or oppose these bills, it's really important to be involved in this legislative process because, again, policy really does dictate on a lot of levels the way that we do our practice. So thanks, Adam. So now we are going to move to a colleague of mine that is coming to us all the way from North Carolina. This is Angela Tankard. And so Angela was previously a director with the Durham, North Carolina YMCA and currently works with the YMCA of the Triangle, which is the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area corporate office. She's a single but newly engaged therapeutic foster parent who recently was able to adopt her 16-year-old daughter. She also volunteers with a local organization called Fostering Families of the Triangle. She's a board member where she supports LGBTQ teen and single parent topics throughout events and support groups. And so she's going to talk a little bit today about her experiences providing a safe and loving and affirming family for her newly adopted child. And so I'm going to turn this over to Angela.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. Like Mickey said, my name is Angela Faith Tankard. I typically go by Angela Faith, and I identify as queer lesbian and use she, her pronouns. As you heard Mickey say, I just adopted my 16-year-old daughter. I could talk all day about my family. My family is literally my pride and joy. And I'm newly engaged and planning a wedding for the fall with my amazing fiance, Jessica, who is also coming in alongside of me to become a foster parent and support LGBTQ plus youth in the foster care system. I have so many things that I can say today, but really, I just want to start by saying everything that Adam said, everything that Adam said, just so good. I mean, at this point, I really want to share just basically some of my experience because Adam touched on everything that I kind of wanted to bring in, and I'm going to be looking at some of those resources that Adam put in as well. But for me, supporting and advocating for youth in the foster care system has always been dear to my heart because foster care is tough just to begin with. And so adding that extra layer of the LGBTQ plus identity just makes it even harder. And so I firmly believe that youth should have access to homes and placements that provide adequate living arrangements, but to have an arrangement or a placement that supports who they are as a human can be absolutely life-changing. It can absolutely change lives, and I've seen it change lives. And so my personal experience so far has been with youth that identify as queer, lesbian, and bisexual, and a varying mix of preferred pronouns. And so just with that, I mean, I've dealt with a lot of situations, specifically one that I tend to come across more often than others is advocating for youth in the mental health setting. And so sometimes that means that I'm looking for appropriate providers, as some of the other presenters have said today. I've come across so many providers who say, you know, we're affirming and we have experience in this, but what they really should say is I've had one client that has identified as this because they really aren't, you know, affirming. And so it's so important to make sure that these youth have appropriate providers who actually can sit and understand. And if they don't know, they're willing to learn and say that they don't know. Because in my experience, I've seen just going with a provider who, you know, use the blanket statements has caused so much more harm. And it's caused the youth to regress a little bit because they've had to sit in these spaces and be vulnerable, but not really be heard. And so pulling back and bringing the social worker in, because sometimes us as foster parents, we only are allowed so much leverage to support these youth, which is very unfortunate, especially for the teenagers and the older kids who have a voice of their own and they can speak for themselves. We still have to kind of go through all these channels and sometimes back through families, but just having the giving the youth the platform to say, this is what I want to see, this is what I believe will help me, this is what I would like to talk about, this is how I identify, and this is what I need to feel that I'm in an affirming environment. I don't want to just see, you know, an affirming sticker on the wall. I need to hear it from my provider. And so that's been a major point. And so also for me as a foster parent, some of the ground level stuff that I never got in foster parent training, or I never got from a social worker or even from the therapist, that I've just applied to my parenting just based on personal experience and personally experiencing family rejection and things like that. Just making sure that youth feel heard and that they feel like their voice matters, because at the end of the day, you know, they have to live with themselves. And so they should be fit for themselves to know. And so understanding that simple things like going shopping and saying, you know, what do you want? Where do you want to go? And listening to them when they say it. I'll give some examples. I had a teenager in my home who identified as lesbian and utilized she, her pronouns, and I had no idea that she would prefer to wear boxers over traditional feminine underwear. And so going to the store and hearing her say, oh, can we go over to the men's section and buy boxers? And me saying, okay, we'll go over, you know, in just a minute. And I literally watched her have a whole moment of life change, because she had come to me from a home who would constantly say, girls can't date each other, and it's supposed to be a man and a woman and things like that. And so these little things I watched changed her life. And so there are just so many different things. I'll say, I lead again with my own personal experience. I don't have experience in foster care, but as a queer youth in dealing with family rejection, and I'm dealing with that now as I plan my own wedding, and I'm 31 years old. And so understanding how painful it is to deal with that sort of rejection now as an adult, dealing with it as a teenager or a child who is out of home placements is, I just can't even imagine the pain that these kids are feeling. And so, it's just really important to me to make sure that these youth feel like they are loved and cared about and wanted, and valuable. They're valuable just as they are, and who they are and how they identify, and all of those things are valid. And then something that Adam said that I also wanted to bring up is about family connections. And so that's something that's really important. Some of the youth that I've had have not had any family connections. And so it has been where a family just hasn't been involved, or family chose not to be involved because of how they identify. And so it's really important to assist youth in building communities around them. There are a lot of programs, and a lot of foster parents, we don't have access to those things. Again, it's from my own personal experience and from my own personal community that I glean these resources. But finding a community for these youth to attach themselves to, and to find adults and other youth that have the same experiences as them, it can also be life-changing. It's really important to do that. But it's also important to realize, again, what Adam said, these kids are at such high risk. They are just at such a high risk for so many negative life experiences. Just one, because they're in foster care, and that already puts them at high risk. And then having these identities it just puts them at a greater risk. And so understanding that these kids can hear the risk that they're up against, and they can learn, and not hiding that from them, it has been a big deal. It's been a life changer. And so I've found resources that I can provide to youth, and to have them sit and talk about, you know, some of the trafficking risks and some of the exploitation risks and things like that. It's been a really big deal. And so for me, I'm really proud of the opportunity that I have. And I'm just so humbled that I have it to serve these youth right where they are, because again, I have a family, but experiencing that family rejection, I want to make sure that I can be the parent that, one, I wish that I had, and two, that these kids need to support and grow. And so that's all I have for today. And I'm definitely open to questions as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Angela, for sharing your experience. And again, you know, we can't underscore enough the importance of acceptance for everybody, right? Not just for our LGBTQ youth, but accepting people in all parts of their identity, making sure that they don't have to parse out the different parts of their identity to be accepted in different communities, whether that's their racial ethnic identity, their SOGI, their religion. All of these things are really important. And, as parents, one of the most important things that we can do for our kids is just say, I love you, right? Not I love you, but, or I love you if, or I love you if you don't, or whatever, but just saying I love you and letting your child know that is really important, whether you're a birth parent, foster parent, blended family, step parent, all of those things. That's really, really important. And I think that's something that we need to go ahead and, really, really think strategically about. Also, if anybody's interested in getting some information on, well, what do affirming parenting behaviors look like? We actually have a resource list here. I'm trying to dig it up right now, but if you email me directly, I'd be happy to send it to people that we talk about. And this was one of the presentations I've done with Angela and some of our team from the National Traumatic Stress Network recently. Okay, what does affirming parenting look like? Like, if we want to say these are behaviors that we want parents to do, or these are behaviors that we want parents to not do, to show that they're being affirming, just contact me and I'll try to find that before the end of the presentation. But if not, just email me about it, because sometimes if you're working with a family that's struggling with their child's sexual orientation or gender identity, giving them some concrete examples of, okay, this is what you could do and this is what you really should try to stay away from can be incredibly helpful. So now, first of all, keep all those questions coming, please. We've got a few coming in, but we would really love to have some more questions, because it looks like we're going to have ample time to be able to address some questions that you may have, particularly since we're covering a lot of material. And I understand that this is a very broad kind of presentation today, but we wanted to get people thinking about different aspects of working affirmatively with LGBTQ youth and families. And so our final presenter is going to be Dr. Deanne Roper, who is an assistant professor of practice at the School of Social Work at UTA. Deanne has more than 20 years of clinical experience in social work, including program development and implementation in complex systems of care. Her research interests include sexual and gender minority health disparities, health risk behaviors, substance abuse, mental health, and the intersection of technology and health behavior change. And so now I am going to turn this over to Dr. Roper.
Thanks, Mickey. And I just want to say, Angela, thank you for sharing some of those personal experiences. I got goosebumps on some of those stories, and those lived experiences, I think, are so important for us to share in safe environments and when we can. So I have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to share that. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. But my thing here is right in the middle of my pictures. Okay, here we go. I think that'll work. So today I have been tasked with talking about a very broad topic, which includes adults, families, parenting, and maybe even elder LGBTQ folks. And so I'm going to be building on a lot of the things that everybody else has sort of talked about, including intersectionality, plus I'll give you some statistics, and then another surprising information about COVID and the impact on queer communities, as well as a little bit of nuances about clinical work with folks. But again, we're all not experts completely, and these are high level ideas and high levels of information. So hopefully what it'll do is pique your interest enough to go do your own self-directed study and exploring and learning on your own. So first I want to kind of cover the intersectionality of Kimberly Crenshaw, who first posited this, and we've kind of hit on that a little bit today about identities. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we understand the fluidity of the intersectionality of our identities. But the other piece of that is how time and the socio-political environment really does intersect even through those different identities. And we sort of mentioned that earlier in one of our speakers. It really does play a huge part in the lives of LGBTQ folks. It does influence all of the experiences, including some of the structural stigma and so forth. So I think it's important that when you are thinking about this topic and working with folks, that you understand the framework. And this is a really good idea, or a good sort of visual of understanding the framework of how really the macro environment runs through all of those identities at some point. So here's a little bit of our descriptive statistics. This is a lot of information from the Williams Institute, which is from UCLA, and they have a lot of data that they collect. There is the link below for some of this data. And actually they have quite a few interactive maps that I think are really cool. And I wanted to use those, but we only have 15 minutes. So they estimate about 11.3 million LGBTQ plus adults in the US. About half of those are cohabitating. About half of the ones that are cohabitating are married. And then about 25% of migrant LGBTQ folks are undocumented. And then surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, we really see that COVID-19 has disproportionate impacts on LGBTQ people of color. One other thing I want to mention here is that Black LGBTQ folks are less likely to live in the South and more likely to live in the West. And Black LGBTQ women are raising children at about the same rate as Black non-LGBTQ women. So interesting statistic there. So here's one of the COVID statistics that I wanted to share with you. I thought this was very interesting, that the positive test rates of COVID positive tests for LGBTQ people of color versus non-LGBTQ people of color. Look at the difference in our statistics here, 14.5% versus 10.6%. So we're seeing some disproportionate impact here. And then the LGBTQ white at 7% and non-LGBT very similar. So additionally, the impact economically is worse as well. Looking at LGBTQ people of color, at 15% have been recently laid off versus non-LGBT people of color. Again, this is from the Williams Institute data that actually comes from the Pew and quite a few other survey tracking studies that they use. So let's talk about raising children. And 24%, now I want to say this about same sex. Okay, this is, when we use the word, we've talked a lot about how language is really important, and language is very important. I think that's part of why we want to always start the topics off like Brittany did with explaining these. Same sex, when I use that term, is actually the term in the research, and it is used by the US Census data. And so the Williams Institute sort of explains that on their website. So this data comes from that particular study. 24% of female same-sex couples are raising children, and then versus 8% of male same-sex couples are raising children. Now, of those that are raising children, 68% are what we would consider biological children, and that could be from assisted reproduction. It could be from previous, as a matter of fact, the majority of it currently is from previous heterosexual relationships and other biological ways of having children. And then 21% are raising adopted children. And then 2.9% are raising foster children. We've talked a little bit about the needs of foster children. And these are actually LGBTQ parents who are actually 4.5 to 7 times more likely to parent an adopted child or foster a child. when you compare it to non-LGBT couples. So this comes from a website called Family Equality, and I have a bunch of websites and resources at the end of the presentation that you'll get to see. But Family Equality talks about the younger LGBTQ folks, ages 18 to 35, of those 77% are already considering having children, which is about 44% more than older folks. In other words, me being one of those older folks in that lived experience, I actually was part of what we call the baby boom era, when we started having, LGBTQ folks started having more children by choice, and not necessarily heterosexual relationships, but in the late 90s and the 2000s. Nowadays, we're seeing people who are planning to adopt and foster children at much higher rates. And you can tell that this is a big shift as the queer population is younger and younger, and we have the socio-political environment changing with time, remembering that first image of how time intersects with our identities. So let's talk about parenting. Queer parenting is pretty much the same, but different. A lot of times there's a lot more discussions about values and negotiations about how we're going to create our family, who's going to be a part of our family. And even when we are blending families, there's many, many topics for discussion here. And it's really important that we as clinicians help folks kind of think through all of the different options that they have, and to be aware of what the options are and actually what the laws are that may affect their reproductive rights. Once they become parents, they really are under the social microscope, sort of like Angela was talking about, and myself as well. There's always this, you know, you're always coming out. And as a queer person, we're always coming out, yes. But when you're a parent, there is so much more risk because every parent wants to protect their children. And so we're always coming out to our neighbors who have children. We're always coming out to other families. We're always coming out to the daycare or the school or the teacher or the pediatrician. And so I think that that's a really important nuanced piece for clinicians and social workers to understand, that every time it's, you know, you would think that it would get easier. It does get a little bit easier, but it's also scary almost every time. So having that framework of understanding that. And then if you think about the age of the person that you're working with, that experience is going to be different based on their age, as we've sort of already seen a little bit of. And then another thing about parenting is helping children understand the language about how do they talk about their families with their peers and their playmates. You know, how do they, you know, kids will say, well, who is that picking you up? Who is that other woman who's picking you up? Who is that? And it's important that whatever the values of the family are, they have to educate their children about that. And unfortunately, there are not a whole lot of families that look like queer families. And for me as a parent at that time, it was really important that we try to be around other queer families so that our daughters could see that they were not the only ones and could help to reduce some of their isolation. So we've talked a little bit about resilience, and that's sort of one of my things that I always sort of harp on, especially with students. And when I'm talking about this, is that we tend to really always work from a deficit model. You know, there's so many disproportionate health disparities and, you know, substance use and smoking and all of these things. And the idea is that it's just, we need to identify the disparities so that we can bring visibility to the issues which help to change some of the political environment and the policies. But it's really important when we're working with folks, as Devin and so many of the other speakers talked about, is resilience. The fact that people survive some of the things that we survive really is a testament to our resilience as people in families, and just having those experiences of structural stigma and microaggressions and all of those things. Within the family, it can act as a stress inoculation against those stigmatizing experiences, as well as when we're in, queer families can tend to value more of an egalitarian perspective, and they tend to have less gendered roles, which actually the research tells us are very strongly correlated to the quality of relationships of parents with the children. And then positive legal environments and climates are really excellent protective factors. This is where the power of advocacy and policy change really does impact our health and wellness, in the sense that we know that in Massachusetts, prior to 2015, when marriage was legalized, that the mental health claims of gay men were reduced when Massachusetts passed their Marriage Act. So we have a lot of research that tells us that even after the Supreme Court approved the Marriage Act, we noticed that about a 7% reduction in suicide attempts among LGBTQ youth. This tells you that it really does demonstrate the power of advocacy and how policy change can really help to support these families when they're facing the front lines of stigmatizing experiences when they take their child to daycare. One of the historical arguments used to be that children need a mom and dad. Well, we also have other research that indicates quite the opposite, that children of queer families are just as well adjusted as children in non-queer families. So moving on, one of the things that happens in mid to late adulthood usually is we begin to lose our parents and we lose loved ones. And I ran across this Black queer artist that I really want to highlight. In this article, she wrote, Parade of Champions, the Failure of Black Queer Grief. She actually talks about the loss of her mother. As a clinician, I have always had this gut feeling and this sort of awareness as a clinician, but also in my personal life, of grief. And, you know, Ms. Clark talks about grief in such a beautiful way. I felt like I needed to really highlight this. And she says to accept loss is to accept queerness. More accurately, to accept the loss of heteronormativity, authorization, and entitlement. With heterosexuality forever unattainable for queers, it's the inevitable experience of failing to achieve these norms. And she talks about the loss of her mother. She says, losing my mother generated an increased sensitivity to my everyday griefs, and that in my grief, I often felt even more invisible and marginalized as a Black queer person. I would love for you all to take a look at this article that she has written, and then some of her videos that she has published. Her voice is so important, and she says these feelings so, so well that I really couldn't describe it without just putting up her quote. So I wanted to share that with you, that there's this deep-seated grief that when we have one loss, it's going to really trigger the rest of the losses in our lives. And as we know, loss does not always equate to death of people, but loss of identities and loss of experiences and roles and so forth. So let's move quickly to our later life adults. This is a picture of George and Jack. And George and Jack were the quintessential gay male couple in Dallas County. I actually had some social experiences with them briefly. They were together 50 years. before they were allowed to marry. They were the first same-sex couple, gay couple, LGBTQ couple, gay men to marry in Dallas County. Unfortunately, Jack died before they were able to to celebrate their first wedding anniversary. Sort of just kind of a picture that really does say 1,000 words, I think. And one of the statistics that we know is that, again, with the aging population, we currently have about 3 million LGBTQ plus folks who are about 50 years or older. In 10 years, that will almost double to 7 million. So we do actually have a graying of the queer community as well. So it's important that we understand some of those issues of older LGBTQ folks. And again, it's going to be dependent on some of those experiences, where they lived, when they lived, and the political environments. One of the ways that you can connect with older folks that identify as LGBTQ, and I do want to stop and say, I meant to say this earlier in terms of language. There are, how important language is. There are a lot, I know personally of a lot of older folks, 60 and older, who really do not like the word queer. They're almost traumatized by the word queer. Mostly gay white men, but others too, not necessarily all. And so it's really important that we understand that just because today that language is accepted, we may not want to always use that particular language with folks. We want to really mimic the language that they use. You want to listen closely and use that same language. The other thing is, don't disclose an LGBTQ identity, with the staff. It's a very private thing, whereas some of the younger folks, including myself, we sort of just burst out, is what we used to call kicking down the door. But because of the political environment and their experiences of shame and stigma, there's a very much more of a closely held issue about their identity. Also, make sure that you understand that just because there's a large age gap between folks, that doesn't mean that it's an exploitive relationship. You certainly, need to be aware of those things, but you also, it's really important to understand that there's a whole swath of a generation that is missing, and that is older gay men who died during HIV and AIDS. And so in terms of creating families and relationships and so forth, there can be some very big age differences between people. Of course, as we get older, we become more isolated, but then also older folks tend to have less children. May not be the case by 2030, of course, but currently right now, there's a risk of being a lot more isolated. But the other resilience piece of that is that a lot of gay men, even women, have really been taking good care of themselves, especially gay men who have HIV. They exercise and vitamins and things like that. So they have a really healthy lifestyle. We also want to make sure that we understand that the close networks of friends who some of us older folks call family, really are our chosen family. Those are protective factors. And we have to really help folks create those connections in the community if they don't have those connections. There are lots of new organizations popping up that are serving LGBTQ and queer seniors. And I encourage you to really make sure that you're aware of those resources. Here are several different topics, websites that I have compiled, and I will drop these in the chat. There we go.
All right, thank you, Deanne. I'm trying to get my video to come back on. Hold on, there we go. Thank you so much for sharing that. So something that we've been hearing throughout this group of presentations is the importance of community and connectedness. And that's for parents, that's for children, that's for those that are young, that's for those that are older or aging. It's so important to have feelings of community and connectedness, belongingness, being part of something, whether it's somebody who is a parent that's struggling with their children's identity, or somebody that has an identity that's been marginalized throughout their lifespan and they want to have this sense of community with people. So that's really important. So thank you so much to all of my presenters. If I can ask you to all turn your cameras back on right now, because we're going to get into the Q&A. First question that I'm going to address is, can we get all of these resources in one document? Yes, I'll compile all the things from the chat and the PowerPoints and things like that. We'll send it to the UTA School of Social Work, and they will send it out to all of the participants. And so I'm just going to go ahead and these questions come up in the order that we received them. We've got about 6 of them in the chat, so we'll try to see if we can go ahead and get these answered real quick. So yes, we can get the resources. So something around language, which is interesting. There's a question that says, are there regional differences in terminology around, the LGBTQ community? And then also, are there age-related differences? And I think that Deanne kind of touched on that, but I'd like our panelists to go ahead and put in your input on that particular topic in terms of regional terminology and also age-related terminology of what's preferred and non-preferred, what have you heard, things like that. So y'all can just jump in whenever you'd like.
Yeah, I think I can kind of answer that just based on a little bit of what I said. And, I am coming from living 20 years in Denver, and I did a short stint in Michigan. And so I think the language that I shared, the resources that I shared are like, they would be preferred throughout the country. I think when we're talking about like differences, I think for the most part, you are probably talking about kind of what Deanne mentioned, are these generational differences, younger LGBTQ folks have reclaimed the word queer basically, and a lot of older folks are still very traumatized by that word. So I feel like I can kind of speak for my experiences here in Texas, my experiences in the Midwest, and my experiences from Colorado, that what I shared would be the most inclusive language to use in those spaces. I'd love to hear from Angela, if there's any regional differences that you identified or didn't like gel with in terms of the language today.
Yeah, so just to go back, I'm in North Carolina. And so
Did I say South Carolina?
I don't know, maybe.
I'm sorry.
It's so interesting because it's typically the same, kind of based on what, you explained here. It's kind of received the same way. For me specifically, and a lot of people in my community, being here in North Carolina and having a lot of religious trauma, the word queer feels safer than gay and lesbian, because that was more of the buzzword in regards to the religious trauma. And so for me, I personally just tacked on queer lesbian to my identity, because queer was what resonated better with me, and it didn't make me feel uneasy. And so I think that it's just really different based on, where you are, but as well as experiences.
Yeah, and I think that really goes back to the conversation that I was having about the word homosexual. That's based a lot in religious trauma specifically. So that's really interesting. But yeah, I think just the kind of like last part I shared about experiences that I had as someone new to Texas, and in many cases it kind of has felt like stepping back in time almost, in terms of like inclusive language and things. So I think even if there are regional differences, we still have to, and not to say that that's what that question was about, but we still really need to look to the community and say, what is this community saying that they want to be called? And I think it's really important if and thinking about inclusive social work practice, that like we ask people if we don't know, like, you know, as we work together, like, how do you want me to talk about that relationship? Or how do you want me to describe the, you know, I think when we think about working with young folks and LGBTQ folks, they're the experts, we're the experts. And so it's really important to listen. Yeah.
Thank you, Brittany. I think it's really important to what you all said about using the language that people use, right? So some people are very comfortable with the word queer to either describe either their sexual orientation or their gender identity. It can be used to describe either or both. And that if it's a word that they're not comfortable with, then we don't use it. If it's a word that they use a lot, then we're going to use it. Another kind of question that piggybacked off of this from the chat was the Q standing for something else, which is questioning, which means that a lot of times our sexual identity and our gender identity are kind of as part of this evolutionary process related to either what we know internally or how we want to express that to the rest of the world. And so we have this Q in there also for questioning. That doesn't mean that they're unsure necessarily. It just means that, you know, they're exploring how they want to go ahead and, you know, internalize their own identity and then express that to the rest of the world. So the Q can also mean questioning rather than questionable. And it can also mean queer, which can mean sexual orientation, gender identity, or both. And so these are all really great questions. The next one that we had here was a lot of these are related to family acceptance and to foster and adoption. One was, are there any LGBTQ affirming foster and adoption agencies in Texas? And I'll go ahead and fill that one and say, it depends on where you live. If you are in a rural place where there's a single faith-based provider, there may not be an affirming foster and adoption care agency. And as Adam mentioned, because of some fairly new legislation in Texas, foster and adoption agencies can refuse to place youth with LGBTQ families, whether it's a single parent family or a multiple parent family. And so that really depends. I actually have some resources that I'll include in the email around some groups that's kind of broken up by the DFPS region of Texas that has affirmative foster care agencies. So like in Houston or DFW, it'll be easier to find that than maybe in Abilene or somewhere like that. And so it just really depends on where you live. So the next one that says, how can I support a youth family member that has come out? Also, how can I explain this to my 2 young sons? Great question. Panelists, what would you say? How do you support a family member that's come out, and how do you explain it to young children? Don't everybody jump in at once.
You know, sometimes I do think that can be even a generational thing as well. You know, when I was raising my 2 daughters, it was really important that I just talk about every chance I could in general about, and I think, you know, anybody can do this regardless if you're a queer family or not, is about how different families all look different. And some people have 2 dads, and some people have 2 moms, and some people have 4 moms. My daughters actually have 4 moms, you know, and so just talking about different, it doesn't mean better or less, just different, just is. And that people can love whoever they want to love, I think, is the bottom line. And that's some of the language that I've used and heard used as well. And I think supporting a loved one is really about how can I support you? And educating yourself. If you don't know something, Google it. Do your own self-directed learning. Don't make them be your teacher. Teach yourself.
Yeah, and I can jump in, and I agree with everything that Deanne said. And I think, honestly, it's about exposure also. Like if you're living in a world that's very like heterosexual or very cisgender focused, that you, if you're thinking about how do I explain this to my kids? Well, one way is that you may not need to explain it if you expand your world. And I think we often don't give children credit for what they understand and already know. And so I think in addition just to really exposing and bringing in diverse like literature for your children, and through, you know, like children's books and conversations and just day-to-day life, many things don't need to be explained then. So I think I would just add that.
Yeah, thanks, Brittany.
I do have some,
There's a lot of really great books out there that are addressing how to talk to kids, particularly younger kids, like elementary age kids, about different types of families and how they may be constituted, and talks about it at a language level that is developmentally appropriate, and in a way that kids can go ahead and understand. So I've add some of those resources into our resource list. And Devin, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say I've got some literature resources as well, so I'll add that to our list.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say the Family Equality website that I mentioned in the slide, they have some wonderful podcasts about you know, queer parenting and explaining things to kids, and have some real life stories that I think can be really helpful for folks too.
We actually at UTA have a professor, I think in the lit department, I think her name is Dr. Miller, that has a blog. I don't know if blog is the right word. Do they still have blogs these days? I'm not sure. That tracks and reviews all kinds of different inclusive literature, whether it's for racialized folks or LGBTQ folks. So I'll try to find that as we have our conversation still. So that could be a cool resource just because she's repping UTA.
Thanks, y'all. So we're going to move on to another one. This is one when I was in clinical practice, I used to get this question all the time. It's what are some suggestions for working with biological families of LGBTQ youth in care? And I'm going to extend this also to foster families, especially when the reason for child welfare entry is because of parental rejection. So I'm actually going to throw this over to Adam first to go ahead and talk about, and then everybody else can kind of chime in on this, because I think this is something that a lot of people struggle with, and it's really important, particularly when religion is involved and things like that. So.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You know, there's really two, there's several big kind of clinical considerations here, but there are two that we really emphasize doing family acceptance work, both with foster families, families of origin. And the first one is to find, you know, really effective ways to use that psychoeducation. That essentially, and we did a big project on the border in my hometown in El Paso a couple of years ago and found this to be really effective with a lot of families, especially whose religious Catholic beliefs were really kind of counter to acceptance and affirmation, that essentially shifting away. If you're anything like me, I don't engage in conversations about theology or religion very well, but I can talk about family acceptance in really kind of not so much shifting away from that, but kind of giving equal parts to helping them to recognize that ideologically, religiously, wherever you're at, right, to do our best to put that to the side for a second and just talk about, you know, the family acceptance, and help families to recognize that their level of acceptance, you know, could be the biggest predictor, the biggest factor that influences whether their child could potentially have depression or be suicidal, or, you know, engage in, you know, some of these risky behaviors that we study so much about LGBTQI plus youth, that essentially that can be a great way to shift that conversation or to help them think about this differently. And that's not the case for everybody. I've certainly had those families where I pulled out every one of those clinical skills in my toolbox, and no matter what I say or how I say it, they just don't budge. But for a lot of families, if we start the conversation there, using that psychoeducation can be a really great clinical tool. And the other thing that we talk about for those families, what we oftentimes see are families who maybe within the nuclear family, and I know that's an outdated term, but maybe with you know, the parents or the siblings, that there's might be some level of acceptance and affirmation there, but parents might discourage their kids from being out at school for fear that they're going to be bullied, or be out to extended family members or at church in those settings. And a lot of that is kind of rooted in fear. And so from the clinical perspective, really help families shift from a focus on fear to one of courage, that essentially, how do we sort of navigate this together as a family? If we, if grandma or aunt or uncle, right, says something or does something that is potentially harmful or not accepting, how are we going to navigate that together? Or if if something happens at the school, how are we going to navigate that together as a family unit? And really kind of helping them to shift towards that direction, with the recognition that so many of the behaviors, even some that might that we know are potentially harmful, are still kind of rooted in that fear. And then from that strength-based perspective, trying to see where the love and the nurture and the those sorts of things are kind of embedded in there, and just clinging to those in our work with families.
Thanks, Adam. And I'd like to add to that. Also, it's really important to, if you see something, say something. And so if somebody is talking in a non-affirming way about a child that you're caring for, whether you're a resource parent, foster parent, or whatever, go ahead and say something and say, you know what, that's not okay for you to be talking that way about this child or about any child, right? If they're saying, oh, well, that's gay or something like that, that people say kind of off the cuff and they don't realize how harmful it is. That's really stigmatizing to different identities and things like that, that it's really important for just kind of looping back to the how do I support family members that come out, including kids, is, if you hear something, people are making negative statements about somebody who's gay, lesbian, trans, just like you would if they were saying something negative about somebody that was African American or Latino. You got to say something, right? So that you normalize speaking up, and you normalize saying that when you hear these either micro or macro aggressions, that it's not okay, and that we're not going to tolerate this, and that everybody's worthy of dignity and respect, and we have to be mindful of our language. And I hear, I'm sure Angela hears this in North Carolina too, because I lived there for a while myself, that a lot of times people are very unaware of how racialized and how heteronormative their language is, because it's just what you hear around you every single day a lot of the time. And so sometimes people don't even know what they don't know. Like when I teach class, I've told people that, when you're saying that's so gay, that's a really negative thing. And about half of the class of students is like, wow, I never really even thought about that way. Or if you say, oh, that's so ghetto, that's very stigmatizing. Again, half the people are saying, wow, I didn't really ever think about it that way. So these are some ways that we can support people in their of living their lives and being who they are. So do you have anything else in terms of like affirming and working with families? And I think Adam really hit the nail on the head. Is I have tried to have theological conversations with families in the past about the nuance and the historical context of what the Bible was, but for most people, their religion is very black and white, and so you don't want to even step in that pool of trying to show them kind of the inconsistencies in their belief systems or things like that, but rather say, you know what, this is about the health and well-being and safety of this child. And these are the things that you can do to promote the health, safety, and well-being of this child. And these are things that you could do that may harm the health, safety, and well-being of this child, and just kind of leave it at that. So we have another question about going through these. Someone mentioned about foster homes. Is it more difficult to find a foster home for younger kids or older kids that are LGBTQ? It's hard to find affirming homes, period. And I didn't know if Angela or Adam might want to talk about that a little bit in terms of, harder for certain groups of kids or certain age groups.
Let's see, Adam jumped off.
Yeah,
In
go
my
ahead,
experience, I typically prefer working with teenagers. So that's typically my preferred age range. I currently have a 9-year-old right now, and that is so different. But I've actually heard social workers tell me that families are more accepting to younger children, especially from like the 5 to 10 age range, because they say, well, they're still young and we can mold their minds. And so that can be very problematic. So it's in my area, I've heard them say that it's easier to place them younger than older, because when they're older, they're set in their ways and they're going to be feisty with it. But the younger ones, you can try and mold their minds. And so again, problematic, but easier to place from what I've heard.
Yeah, I would
add
echo
to
what
that.
Angela said, that I do think there's more kind of vulnerability there, especially if you think about a state like Texas, where we have so many, essentially since the 1970s, the way that we have recruited foster parents is from largely conservative faith-based organizations and agencies that essentially for many of those younger youth, and I don't think the data exists to essentially tell us exactly how much, if it is more difficult to find affirming and accepting placements for younger youth than teens. But I do think what Angela said there, that essentially they'd be a lot more vulnerable to some of those, even if it's not, putting them in conversion therapy or reparative therapy, oftentimes, foster parents too, will have a lot of say in terms of, if they're going to get counseling for a kid or get other services in terms of who those individuals are. And we know in a lot of areas, especially more rural areas, that, a lot of the folks who do the counseling for kids in foster care to accept those Medicaid contracts, might engage in certainly practices that aren't accepting and affirming in a lot of ways as well.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, and I want to clearly state this for everybody, and I always do this in every training that I do, is that regardless of what you may have heard from your religious leaders or in the media or from whomever, there is no scientific evidence available, period, that supports that types of counseling interventions can change somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity. There is just absolutely no research that supports it, or no credible research that supports that. And so people that are engaging in what we call conversion therapy or SOGI change efforts are doing something that we do have a lot of research that supports, that these interventions are very harmful and traumatic for youth, for adults even. There's a lot of adults that will self-refer for those types of things because they have so much stigma and shame projected on them from the community that they're like, wow, if I go to this type of counseling intervention, then I won't be gay anymore. And we know that those things do not work, and that we should not be referring for those types of services. I personally feel like it's professional malpractice if people that are licensed providers actually engage in those types of interventions, but a lot of times they're done by unlicensed providers, so pastoral counselors and things like that. But I do want to make sure that our audience knows that there is absolutely no research to support the efficacy of those change efforts, and that they are very, very traumatizing for the people that are engaged in those types of services. So I just want to make sure that we have that out there and that it's very explicit and clear. So we have a few more minutes before we conclude. So I think what I'm going to do is just ask the panelists, is there anything else that you'd like to share, either personal experience, professional experience, or whatever, that you think might be helpful to the people that have tuned into this particular webinar?
I think I can just piggyback off what Mickey shared. If you're interested to learn more about the harms of conversion therapy, check out the Trevor Project. They have a ton of great data on it, and visually pleasing data and things. And I am currently teaching policy class right now. So I have like a policy mindset, and there are 3 bills related to conversion therapy that are up in our current Texas legislature right now, all by Representative Terry Meza. I'm not sure if I said her name correct. And as someone new to Texas, I believe that she's repping in our neighborhood here. I think from somewhere in North Texas. I can't remember, maybe Grand Prairie. I'm not sure. A member of the House, but it's House Bill 3196, 2753, and 2516. And they've all been already assigned to their committees. So if you are interested in this and feel passionately about it, that's an avenue, that you could reach out to the House rep and say, like, I'm here to support you. If that looks like testifying, if it even gets in front of testifying at committee, if it makes it to that point, or if not, just to say, I'm here, I see this, and I appreciate it. I think that's really important for us as civically engaged citizens, which our social work code of ethics calls us to be civically engaged citizens. To do, someone just said she represents Irving, Texas. So yeah, like right in our, if you're coming, to this from UTA or from North Texas, like right in our neighborhood. So just to be encouraging, it is something that I can only assume is very discouraging to be submitting a bill that in Texas that supports the ending of such a harmful practice, because I'm thinking that bills like this don't often go anywhere. And so just to be supportive and say, I support this, I see you, thank you for this work, I think is very important when we think about how we as social workers can be living into our values and ethics as civically engaged and critical social workers.
I just saw something pop up in the chat. Can you please repeat the House bills? And we will be sending out an email with all of this information in it. But just to be clear, these are bills that have been introduced to the Texas legislature that would prohibit any licensed provider, so anybody with a license that's licensed by the state of Texas, from engaging in any SOGI change efforts. And so we'll send out that information now. Unfortunately, there are frequently bills that are introduced into the Texas legislature supporting providers' ability to be able to provide these interventions and be free from civil liability of being sued for malpractice, which is very, very dangerous, right? We want to make sure that NASW and our other professional organizations are actively advocating against those types of bills, which they have been over the years. Will Francis has been instrumental in doing that type of work through his work at the legislature. But, you know, it's nice to see that we do have some bills that are protective of vulnerable people. And that I think that now that also we have an LGBTQ caucus in the Texas legislature, I believe there for this session, there are 7 members of the caucus that are really trying to change the narrative around legislation related to LGBTQ people within the state of Texas. And so that's encouraging. Okay. Anything else? Final thoughts, final comments? Got about 10 minutes. I know this group is loud, you know, more loud or engaged than this. So please, you know, anything else that you'd like to add that you feel our listeners or our attendees should know?
I'll just keep talking because, you know, I don't have a problem with that. I think, Mickey, you said something so important, and that's to use our voice. And when we see something, to say something. And you touched on it at the end of what you were saying, but I know that there's educators on this webinar, and I think that's just so important in our role as educators and thinking about language and what it means to be a social worker who practices ethically and is a critically engaged social worker is to constantly ground our classes in inclusive language. And that can feel so uncomfortable for some people to call our students in about microaggressions that happen in class. And I would just, I think if we can, you know, begin our classes with the expectation that that's what we're going to do, it's not that hard. And I think it's really what we're here to do as social work educators. And when we think about serving LGBTQ youth and families and communities across the lifespan, we have the opportunity to impact all of these folks who are going to go do that. To go do that critical work once they leave our institutions, if we're teaching folks. And so I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can do to train up the next class of folks that are going to work with our LGBTQ communities and kiddos.
Thanks, Brittany. And Deanne, you look like you had something to say, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say this earlier, but you know, it's sort of a criticism of some of our textbooks. Even some of our updated textbooks still use the term homosexual or homosexuality. And we as educators need to correct that and bring that to the attention of students and really indicate, you know, educate at that point that that's not an outdated term. And I hear that among faculty sometimes. It's just, it's disappointing that it's still in some updated textbooks.
Right, and that we've got to bring it to the attention of publishers and
exactly
are the actual people that wrote the textbook, that they may not have this as their area of expertise and be like, I know your intentions were good, however, this is non-preferred or non-affirming language at this point. Here are some suggestions for other ways to go ahead and talk about this issue, for sure.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
And I'll add to that. I wasn't jumping in. I literally just read a great article about mansplaining in Zoom sessions. So I'm not hitting that join by. Wait till 2 or 3 people go first. You know, when it comes to microaggressions, as social workers especially, you know, because we hear this all the. I certainly see in the research that I do, so many youth. It's as though those microaggressions are just as impactful and just have just as profound of consequences as some of the more just overt homophobic and transphobic and heterocentric stuff that we can be equally as intentional, you know, in just not engaging in microaggressions, but countering those in some ways. I was thinking about Angela's story there about the kid with the boxer shorts, and for that kid, right? And I hear this over and over. Those are the stories and the encounters that they talk. That, you know, in essentially in that moment, I knew that this is somebody I could open up with. This is somebody I could trust. This is somebody who I could confide in. You know, something as simple as allowing them to shop for the, you know, the boxer shorts that they wanted, right? Might seem so minor, but can have such profound implications. And it's the same thing with our language and our terminology. And the other thing that I would add is that for a lot of social workers, what we tend to see is there's a lot of intimidation by the fluidity in the changing terminology, and that sometimes can serve as a barrier and keep them from engaging in conversations and in talking about certain things. And what we hear, you know, from youth, and I would imagine it's a very similar dynamic with adults, is that can't be a barrier, right? That you know, we do want to engage the, you know, the most recent terminology, the most affirming and inclusive language that we can possibly engage in, and that's up to us, right? That's a very small ask on the part of social workers. But we can't avoid conversations, especially moments where we can really advocate for somebody, because we're intimidated by that the fluidity of the language and the terminology. So I think that's a really important issue to sort of navigate there.
Thanks, Adam. We had another question to come. I'm sorry, Diane, I didn't mean to cut you off. Do you want to go ahead and add something? We had one more question come into the chat.
I was just going to add something and sort of a little bit related, and that is in terms of the theory behind, you know, the disparities often experienced by sexual minority and gender minority folks is minority stress theory, right? And one of the concepts of that theory is that there is an anticipation of rejection based on previous experiences of stigmatizing aggressions and structural stigma. And so I think it's important as clinicians that we understand that there is already an expectation of folks that we may work with, regardless of age, that there's an expectation that they will be rejected as just the frame for understanding experiences.
Thanks, Deanne. So this other question I think is really good, and I think I'll go ahead and address this one because I've worked with a lot of people with faith-based trauma. It says many churches often refer gay people to a 12-step program to supposedly help them, which I don't feel is appropriate, which is correct. That is not an appropriate resource for people. Are there any resources directly mainly for churches helping people understand that gay people can love God and God loves them? So what I will say to that is there are a number of affirming faith-based communities throughout the state of Texas, and I will also include a list that one of my groups has compiled about that, where they are inclusive churches. I actually just read an article this morning about a church in Georgia that said they were going to be inclusive and welcome in anybody from any background, and they got kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention because of that. And something that we want to make sure is that we're not creating this false dichotomy between people of faith and people identifying as LGBTQ, right? These are all parts of people's identities, and you can't separate them out as an either or. They're a both and for everybody. And for a lot of people in the community, their faith belief system is really, really important to them. And when they are shunned and thrown out of their churches, it is a devastating loss to them. And so I can send out also as part of our resources around this. And I had a question that was a follow-up about Spanish language resources. I don't have a ton of those. I think I have one around acceptance and faith-based inclusive communities of faith for different religions in different areas of the state. But it's really important for us to reiterate to people that are struggling with kind of that false dichotomy of being part of the community versus being part of a community of faith, that there are places of worship out there that are inclusive and affirming, and that can be one of their greatest strengths and sources of resiliency. And so we don't want to separate people off from them, but offer them additional resources in that area, because that can be something that is incredibly affirming and life-saving for some people. Anything else? I think we're out of time. So I just want to take this time to say thank you to everybody that participated in this webinar, and especially thank you to my amazing panelists who, without whose help today, we couldn't have made this event a success. And I hope this is going to be the first of many webinars that we have in this area, because I think this really is something that we do not give enough lip service or thoughtful consideration to when we're talking about diversity and inclusion. We want to go ahead. Oh, and thank you, Angela, for sharing her Instagram. And so if you want to follow what's going on in the faith family, then we can go ahead and follow Angela. And again, we're going to compile all these resources in one place for you, because I know it's kind of hard to follow in the chat. And there's a lot of them out there, and we all have this knowledge that we bring to the table. I'm going to ask the presenters also to, if they'll let us share their PowerPoints and whatnot, so that it will give everybody a starting point for if you have needs in terms of knowledge or skills or training, that you know where to go to start answering some of the questions that you may have, or that the families that you work with have. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and I guess that's it.